AITAH for calling children's social care on my neighbor when she left her children on my doorstep. I've been sitting with this knot in my stomach ever since yesterday, and I can't shake the feeling that I might have crossed a line I can't come back from. My husband hasn't spoken to me since, and honestly, I don't blame him. The weight of it all just hit me, and now I can't stop second-guessing myself. I need to get this all out, though, because I'm losing my mind over what happened. We live in one of those cul-de-sacs where everyone's up in everyone else's business. You can't step outside without at least 3 neighbors commenting on what you're doing or asking you for something. At first, I thought it was charming. A community where people looked out for one another. But the shine wore off quickly, especially when I realized that not everyone respects boundaries. One neighbor in particular has been a source of constant frustration, Claire. She's the kind of woman who always seems to be in the middle of a crisis, always just a little too chaotic, and always very good at making her problems everyone else's problems. She has 6 kids, ranging from a baby who's just a few months old to a 7-year-old who might as well be feral. And somehow, despite having what seems like an army of children, she's constantly finding ways to dump them on other people. It's not like she politely asks, either. It's more like she shows up at your door, announces she needs to leave, and then takes off before you can say no. I've been caught in her trap more times than I care to admit. At first, I thought it was just bad luck. She'd show up with this frantic energy, rambling about some emergency, and before I knew it, I'd agreed to watch her kids. But after a while, I realized it wasn't bad luck, it was her mo. She's done it to nearly everyone in the neighborhood at some point. I've even heard she managed to convince the retired couple to doors down to babysit for her for an entire weekend once. Who does that? Yesterday, it happened again. I'd seen Claire outside earlier in the day, herding her chaotic brood like a frazzled shepherd trying to keep wayward sheep from scattering. The double stroller looked like it was on its last legs, groaning under the weight of 2 squirming toddlers, as Claire pushed it unevenly down the sidewalk. Meanwhile, the older kids were darting around like they were playing some dangerous game of tag, coming far too close to the street for my comfort. Watching her from my window, I felt that familiar pit form in my stomach. She was looking frazzled, frantic even, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she came knocking. The question wasn't if, it was when. I didn't want to deal with it. I was tired. I had my own plans for the day, and honestly, I'd hit my limit with Claire's antics months ago. So, I made a decision. I wouldn't answer the door. I turned off the TV, muted my phone, and retreated to the kitchen, hoping she'd think I wasn't home. I could hear the kids laughing and squealing outside as they passed by, and I held my breath, praying they wouldn't stop. For a moment, I thought I was in the clear. But then, there it was, the first knock. It was a soft knock at first, almost polite, like she was testing the waters. I stayed completely still, gripping the edge of the counter as if that would somehow make me invisible. A second knock followed, louder this time, more insistent. Then a third. By the 4th knock, it wasn't knocking anymore, it was pounding. It sounded like she was using her entire fist, each hit reverberating through the house. I flinched every time, feeling the tension build with each thud. When the banging didn't work, she started rattling the letterbox, and for a moment, I genuinely thought she might rip it off its hinges. My heart was racing. It felt ridiculous to be hiding in my own house, but I didn't know what else to do. Finally, I gave in. The noise was too much, and honestly, I was starting to worry she'd attract the whole neighborhood with her commotion. I marched to the door, muttering under my breath, and swung it open, fully intending to tell her I couldn't help her this time. But before I could even get a word out, she was already talking. It wasn't just talking, it was a full-on verbal barrage. She was speaking so quickly that I could barely keep up, throwing out bits and pieces about how she had some urgent appointment, how she had no one else to ask, and how she'd be back by Sunday. Her words came out in a rush, a jumble of desperation and excuses that left no room for interruption. Before I could even process what she was saying, she shoved the baby carrier into my arms, nearly knocking me off balance. The baby, who had been calm up until that moment, let out a wail, the sound cutting through the chaos like a siren. Then came the older kids, filing into my house as if they were soldiers following orders. No hesitation, no questions, just straight in, like this was a normal part of their lives. One of them grabbed a spot on the couch, another headed straight for the kitchen, and the rest scattered like a small, noisy storm. I stood there, baby carrier in hand, completely blindsided. "Claire, I can't do this," I managed to stammer, but she wasn't listening. She was already halfway down the path, throwing out more words about how the cab was waiting and how grateful she was for my help. I called out to her, louder this time, trying to make her stop. "I can't watch them. You have to take them with you." She turned briefly, just long enough to say something about how I was a lifesaver and how she'd explain everything later. Then she was gone. I didn't think I'd just reacted. I stepped out onto the path and grabbed her arm, pulling her to a stop. "I'm serious, Claire. I can't do this. I have plans today. You can't just leave them here." My voice was sharp, almost desperate, but she didn't seem to care. She pulled her arm free with more force than I expected, muttering something under her breath about not having time for this, and took off at a jog toward the cab idling at the curb. I stood there, frozen, watching as she climbed in without so much as a backward glance. Within seconds, the cab door slammed shut, and they were gone. I turned back to my house, where the chaos had already begun. The baby was screaming at the top of her lungs, her tiny face bright red and scrunched in frustration. One of the toddlers had wrapped himself around my leg, babbling incoherently as he tugged at my pants. From the living room, I could hear the older kids arguing over something, their voices growing louder by the second. It was like being dropped into the middle of a whirlwind, and I didn't know where to start. My head was spinning, my chest was tight, and all I wanted to do in that moment was scream. I took the kids inside and tried to get a hold of Claire, but of course, she didn't answer her phone. I sent her a text, telling her she had 10 minutes to come back or I'd call Children's Services. I wasn't bluffing, I was livid. How dare she just drop her kids on me without even waiting for my consent? When she finally called me back, she acted like I was the unreasonable one. She said she was already out of the city and couldn't come back. Then she suggested I take the kids to Jennifer, an elderly neighbor who has enough health issues without being saddled with 6 kids for a weekend. I told Claire no. I wasn't comfortable passing her kids off to someone else, especially someone who hadn't agreed to it. Claire started yelling at me, calling me all kinds of names, and then hung up on me. That was the last straw for me. I called Children's Services and explained the situation. They took it seriously, especially when I mentioned how young some of the kids were. Within an hour, they showed up with the police to take the kids. Watching them load those kids into their cars was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but at the time, I convinced myself it was the right thing to do. Claire needed to face some consequences for her actions. Later that evening, Claire found out what I'd done, and she lost her mind. She called me screaming and threatening me if I wasn't kidding. I sent her a video of the authorities taking the kids, thinking it would show her how serious I was. She hung up on me, and I haven't heard from her since. When my husband came home, I thought he'd back me up. I was wrong. He was furious. My husband grew up in foster care, and he was horrified by what I'd done. He called me a right cow and said I had no idea what I'd just put those kids through. He told me stories about his own experiences in care, things I'd never heard before, and it broke my heart. He said I should have just refused to take the kids at the door or, at the very least, taken them to Jennifer like Claire suggested. He argued that once I handed them off to Jennifer, it wouldn't have been my problem anymore. I tried to explain that I didn't feel comfortable dragging an elderly woman into this mess, but he wasn't having it. He said I'd acted out of spite and that anything bad that happened to those kids in care was on me. Now I'm sitting here, replaying everything in my head, wondering if I made the biggest mistake of my life. Did I overreact? Should I have just watched the kids for the weekend? Should I have taken them to Jennifer's? I didn't think about the consequences of foster care. I just wanted to get out of a situation I never agreed to be in. But now, after hearing my husband's stories, I feel sick to my stomach. What if I made things worse for those kids? I'm tempted to go to Children's Services and explain that it was all a misunderstanding, but I don't know if that would even help at this point. I just feel so lost. Am I the asshole? Update 1. After the chaos of that day, I was completely drained emotionally, mentally, and physically. The house felt eerily quiet once the children were gone, but the silence didn't bring the relief I had hoped for. Instead, I felt a gnawing tension that wouldn't leave me alone. Every creak of the house, every distant sound outside, made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming, that Claire wouldn't let this slide. I replayed everything in my head: her frantic drop-off, her ignoring my protests, and the eventual arrival of children's services. I told myself I'd done the right thing, that she'd left me with no choice, but the pit in my stomach kept growing. My husband's furious reaction hadn't helped. His words had cut deep, making me question every decision I'd made. The next morning, I was running on fumes, barely keeping myself together. My husband had left for work without so much as a glance in my direction, and the house felt cold and heavy in his absence. I was cleaning up the remnants of the kids' short stay crumbs scattered across the couch, a sippy cup forgotten on the table, a blanket tossed on the floor when I heard it. A knock at the door. My heart sank. It wasn't a gentle knock. It was loud, forceful, demanding. My stomach churned as I froze in place, gripping the edge of the counter. I already knew who it was. There was no doubt in my mind that Claire had come back. For a moment, I considered just ignoring it again, hoping she'd go away if I didn't answer. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, like she was trying to break the door down. Each slam against the wood sent a jolt through my body, and I could feel the tension building in my chest. She wasn't going to leave, that much was clear. The knocking grew so aggressive that I was genuinely afraid she might damage the door. I couldn't take it anymore. My hands were shaking as I made my way to the door, trying to brace myself for whatever was coming next. The second I unlocked and opened it, Claire was there, standing inches from me, her face red with fury. She didn't waste a second before she launched into a full-blown tirade. Her voice was loud, sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. She was shouting accusations at me, her words spilling out so fast I could barely keep up. According to her, everything that had happened was my fault. She screamed that I was a terrible person, that I'd taken her children away, that I'd ruined her life. She called me names that I won't even repeat here, each one more vicious than the last. Her hands flailed as she gestured wildly, her anger barely contained. It was like she was a storm, and I was caught in the middle of it. I tried to stay calm, but the words were bubbling up inside me, and I couldn't hold them back. I told her that her children weren't my responsibility, that it wasn't my job to look after them just because she decided to dump them on me. I told her that what she'd done abandoning her kids without my consent was completely unacceptable. But none of it got through to her. She didn't care about my reasoning, didn't want to hear about my frustrations. She was so consumed by her anger that she couldn't see anything else. She shouted that I must not have taken care of her children properly, that I'd failed them, that I was the reason they'd been taken. The accusation stung, even though I knew it wasn't true. I told her that I'd done the best I could in an impossible situation, but she kept yelling, refusing to hear a word I said. Her voice grew louder, more shrill, her anger boiling over like a pot left on the stove too long. Then, she made the declaration that nearly made me laugh out of sheer disbelief. She said she was calling the police. She spat the words at me like a threat, as though the police would come and magically undo everything. I told her to go ahead, that she could call them if she wanted, but it wouldn't change the fact that she was the one who'd left her children with me without my agreement. I stood my ground, even as my heart raced. She pulled out her phone, her hands trembling with rage, and made the call right there on my doorstep. When the police arrived, everything escalated even further. Claire immediately launched into her story, painting me as the villain. She told them I'd taken her children, that I'd called children's services out of spite, that I was trying to ruin her life. Her voice was loud and desperate, full of venom, as she tried to twist the narrative in her favor. The officers listened, their faces neutral, as she laid out her accusations. When it was my turn to speak, I explained everything in as much detail as I could. I told them about the way Claire had shown up unannounced, how she'd ignored my protests, how she'd thrust her children into my care without waiting for my consent. I told them how she'd refused to come back for her kids when I called her and how she'd suggested I dump them on an elderly neighbor instead. I explained that I'd only called children's services because I felt I had no other option, that I wasn't equipped to care for 6 children, especially not without any prior warning. The officers asked questions, their expressions serious as they pieced together the story. They didn't interrupt me, didn't rush me, just let me speak until I'd said everything I needed to say. When they turned back to Claire, she was still fuming, her words coming out in rapid bursts as she tried to defend herself. But it was clear she wasn't getting the reaction she wanted. The officers exchanged glances before telling her they needed to take her down to the station to sort everything out. That's when Claire really lost it. She started screaming again, saying that it was all my fault, that I was the reason she was being taken in. She kept shouting as they led her away, her voice echoing down the street. I stood there, shaken but strangely numb, watching as the police car drove off. The cul-de-sac was quiet again, but the air was thick with the tension she'd left behind. Update 2. It was about a week later when I first noticed the commotion. The days since Claire's outburst and the police taking her to the station had been strangely quiet. I hadn't seen her, hadn't heard her, and honestly, I'd started to hope she might not come back at all. There was a certain peace in the neighborhood, a calm I hadn't realized I'd been craving until it settled in. No kids running wild in the street, no frantic knocks at my door. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could relax in my own home without waiting for the next Claire-induced disaster. But, of course, peace never lasts. It was late afternoon when I heard a knocking, loud and insistent, echoing down the corridor. It wasn't coming from my door this time, but it was the kind of knocking I'd recognize anywhere. My stomach twisted. I paused, listening, hoping I was wrong, but then came another knock, and another, the sound bouncing off the walls as it moved closer. My curiosity got the better of me, and I opened my door just a crack to see what was going on. There she was, Claire, standing at someone else's door with her children clustered around her. The baby was in her arms, wailing loudly, while the other kids clung to her legs or hovered nearby. She looked disheveled, her hair tied back messily, her face red and tired. She knocked again, harder this time, and I could see the tension in her shoulders as she waited for someone to answer. No one did. She moved to the next door, the kids trailing behind her like little ducklings. She knocked again, this time with even more force, but there was still no response. I watched as she worked her way down the corridor, going door to door, knocking louder and louder, growing more frustrated with each unanswered attempt. It was almost surreal, seeing her back at it so soon after everything that had happened. I hadn't even known she'd been released. I stood there, watching in stunned silence, until she eventually gave up. She turned and walked back toward her apartment, her head held high, her kids trailing behind her like nothing had happened. It was as if the events of the past week hadn't fazed her at all. She acted like this was normal, like she hadn't just been in police custody, like her children hadn't been taken away by authorities. Later that day, I reached out to a mutual acquaintance, one of the few people in the neighborhood, who was still willing to talk to me after the drama with Claire. They told me that Claire had been released earlier that week and that her children had been returned to her shortly after. Apparently, the authorities had given her a warning, telling her not to let it happen again, but that was it. She'd been told to get her act together, but clearly, she wasn't listening. The more I heard, the more it became clear that Claire hadn't changed. If anything, she seemed emboldened. People had seen her out and about with her kids, still trying to pawn them off on unsuspecting neighbors whenever it suited her. She'd been knocking on doors up and down the street, asking for favors, trying to rope people into watching her kids just like before. But this time, no one was biting. Word had spread about what happened, and everyone was avoiding her like the plague. Over the next few days, I heard her more than once. The sound of her knocking became a familiar background noise in the afternoons and evenings, followed by muffled arguments with neighbors who dared to answer. She never knocked on my door again, though, and for that, I was grateful. Maybe she was too angry at me to try, or maybe she'd finally realized that I wasn't someone she could manipulate anymore. Either way, I was relieved to be left out of it. One evening, I decided to tell my husband what I'd learned. I was nervous, unsure of how he'd react, but I felt like he deserved to know. When I told him that Claire had been released and that her children had been returned to her, his expression shifted. He didn't say much, but I could see the tension in his shoulders ease, like a weight had been lifted. Over the next few days, his attitude toward me softened. He stopped avoiding me, stopped snapping at me, and gradually, things between us started to feel normal again. I think, in some small way, he felt reassured that the children were back with their mother. Even if he didn't agree with how I'd handled things, knowing that they weren't stuck in the foster system seemed to give him some peace. And for the first time since this whole mess began, I started to feel like we might be able to move past it. As for Claire, she remained a constant presence in the neighborhood. Her knocking, her arguments, her chaotic energy, they became part of the daily rhythm again, but this time, I wasn't part of it. She'd burned too many bridges, and even the neighbors who used to tolerate her seemed to be keeping their distance. I couldn't help but wonder how long it would last, how long she could keep going before something else happened. But I stayed out of it. I had my own life to focus on, and I wasn't about to get dragged back into hers.